Started, everybody. Hello, welcome to the Shenandoah Valley Civil War Museum. My name is Michael. I'm a ranger here with the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation. I'm very excited to have everybody here today. We're talking about something pretty niche, but it's been really interesting regarding the American Civil War, and that is the career of Confederate warship CSS Shenandoah. The Shenandoah is really interesting, and the reason why I wanted to talk about it is because, well, we're in the valley that the ship is named after, but also this is taking place after the surrender of Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. So something that does apply to where we're talking about this time of year, 160 years ago, April of 1865. So before we get started, I want to thank you guys all once again for being here today. I also want to point out that 250 years ago was the battles of Lexington and Concord. It's the shot heard around the world. We can thank ourselves being here today in the United States of America because of that day. So once again, happy anniversary. We're kicking off America 250 here, so I'm excited to have you all here. This is something I'm very excited about. The CSS Shenandoah, like I said, we don't get to talk much about naval history here in the Shenandoah Valley. Not many blockade runners operating in the valley. Not many major rivers that these things can operate in or seize. So, like I said, we don't get to talk about the naval history of the Civil War here in the valley that often, but this is a great avenue to go ahead and talk about that. I'm personally really excited to talk about this because the naval history is kind of a guilty pleasure of mine. I started off getting into history when I was a young boy. I visited the battleship Massachusetts in Battleship Cove. That was a great experience for me, and that got me really interested in history to begin with. When I was raised with both my parents, and I was really close with my grandparents as well. My paternal grandfather was an amphibious sailor in World War II. He had landed at Guam, Luzon, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, took part in the occupation of mainland Japan. On top of that, you have a guest coming in here? Oh, wait. On top of that, my maternal grandfather, he was a sailor that operated in the riverboats at Vietnam throughout that war. After the war, he served in the surface fleet of the U.S. Navy for a number of years on destroyers, guided missile cruisers. He actually served on the USS Shenandoah, so there's another tie-in right there. And then he would serve in the submarine fleet, both with fast attack submarines and ballistic missile subs. Me personally, when I first went to college, I was a midshipman with the United States Naval Reserves Officers Training Board for a short period of time. And then the first museum I ever worked in was the Submarine Force Museum and Library, hosted by this U.S. Naval History and Heritage Command, the crown jewel of that museum being this, the USS Nautilus.
Where is that?
That's in Groton, Connecticut. So right around New London. Definitely recommend if you guys are interested in naval history and the submarine force, go check that out. So it's a crown jewel museum. So like I said, this is something that really does interest me right here, naval history, especially tying it into the Civil War. Without further ado, let's start talking about the career of the Shenandoah. November 5th, 1865, a warship starts to appear outside of the River Mersey, near Liverpool. It's in rough condition. The copper plating had been mostly scratched off. The side of the vessel was riddled with barnacles and seaweed. It was in a pretty rough condition. The warship starts to sail down River Mersey, flying the Confederate stainless banner. It'll dock next to the HMS Donegal. The next day, the crew is going to surrender their warship. The captain, James Iredell Waddell, will disembark, surrender his warship to the Donegal. He will march his way over to Liverpool Town Hall to surrender the CSS Shenandoah. This is November 6, 1865, 6 months after Robert E. Lee surrendered Grant at Knapp's courthouse. 6 months, or months later after Jefferson Davis's capture. This is months following Stan Wade's surrender, the last major Confederate force to surrender on the grounds. Now, the very final Confederate flag was being surrendered as well. So how did we get here? To a warship that had surrendered months after its nation had ceased operations, months after its government had disbanded. Well, to talk about the career of the CSS Shenandoah, we're going to go all the way back and talk about the United States Navy in the Civil War, and the Confederate States Navy. In November of 1861, the Confederate Navy is created. Stephen Mallory is appointed as Secretary of the Navy. Mallory's a pretty capable individual. He had served in the United States Navy for a period of time, and he was tasked with a really hard obstacle. Try and create a navy where no navy had been, or no navy had existed. On top of that, when the Confederacy secedes, there's only really one naval yard that's operable, and that's in Pensacola, Florida. Not long after the Confederacy secedes, Gosport Naval Yard will be abandoned by the United States Navy. When they abandon, they're going to destroy money in the stores, they're going to sink a number of the ships, scuttle them, and that includes the USS Merrimack. That will be raised. I think we all know where this is going. It's cut off, turned into an iron casemate, and that becomes the CSS Virginia. Now, although the Confederacy has two operable Navy yards, there's a blockade of the Confederacy. This is the Union Navy's war doctrine throughout the majority of the Civil War. Blockade the ports of the Confederacy. This means goods cannot go into those naval yards, so ships, it's really hard to build them out there when you don't have the goods. So what happens is the Confederacy needs to realize is they can't stand up and fight the U.S. Navy mano a mano on the seas. They're going to have to go ahead and find a way to operate and to affect the war itself. And that's going to lead them to commerce raiding. Commerce raiding is basically attacking the merchant ships or attacking the vessels that are carrying arms, stores, and goods relating to the U.S. Navy or the other Navy or whatever Navy you're attacking right there. And basically it's just trying to weaken out the U.S. Navy. But also, remember, the U.S. Navy is blockading the ports of the Confederacy. If these commerce raiders sail on the seas attacking these merchant vessels, U.S. Navy is going to have to send out warships to try and hunt down these commerce raiders, eventually weakening and stringing out the Union blockades around those southern ports, where maybe a blockade runner can break through, bring goods, or break out and end up joining the Confederate Navy. Now on April 20th, 1861, which is 164 years ago tomorrow, that's going to be when Gosport Naval Yard is abandoned. So the Confederate Navy is slowly coming into form. By this point, there's no warships in the Confederate Navy. They are just operating really down in Mobile, Alabama. Later on that month, the CSS Sumter is going to become the official first warship of the Confederate Navy. It's going to break through the Union blockade of New Orleans, and it's going to go on a tear after this. Within 6 months, the CSS Sumter is going to score 18 prizes on the seas. And this is starting to build up in the minds of the Confederate Navy. Officers within the Navy, the Secretary of the Navy, Stephen Mallory, they're seeing the success of CSS Sumter. They want to also implement this with other warships. They want to have commerce raiders. So later on that month, April of 1861, Stephen Mallory is going to recruit James D. Bullock. Bullock was born in 1823 in Georgia. He was the son of a prominent Georgian planter family. He was schooled up in Hartford, Connecticut as a young boy. It's my hometown out there. He spent 15 years in the United States Navy. The 5 years before the American Civil War, he had been working as a private merchant captain, mostly operating between New Orleans and New York. He was living up in New York right around the time that he was being recruited by the Confederate Navy. So by the time he assumes this position, he now has to sneak out of New York, through the northern states, and then he's going to eventually get to the Confederate States and will travel down to Mobile, Alabama to start reporting for his duties. Now, his family, he's going to leave his family when he leaves New York. This includes a number of, like I said, he's going to abandon his family when he leaves New York. They don't know where he's going. Many of them don't understand that he's joining the Confederate Navy at this point. This includes his sister Martha. Sister Martha, she probably didn't have too much time to worry about her brother or where he was going. She was busy raising a son by the name of Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt's uncle was James Bullock, the man who would oversee the construction of the Confederate Navy's fleet out in England. When Bullock makes his way to Mobile, he gets the word he's going over to Europe. He is going to Liverpool to try and oversee the construction of a Confederate fleet being built in Europe. Now, when he's sent over there, he is loosely referred to as the most dangerous man in the Confederacy. Why? Well, because he's out there and he is recruiting sailors, he is recruiting shipbuilders to help construct his warships, and it goes pretty rough when he first gets there. The British have laws against neutrality. The British see the Civil War as not necessarily the United States versus the Confederate States. They see them as two different belligerent states. So the British don't necessarily recognize the Confederacy. They count them as a belligerent. They count the United States as a belligerent in this conflict. And because of their laws, they are not allowed to necessarily help out the belligerents in a foreign war. But the Confederate Navy is going to kind of sidestep around this using private shipbuilders. They use this kind of weird gray area to claim that, well, they're not being built in public shipyards, they're being built in private shipyards. And that's how the Confederate Navy is able to quickly build a few ships. They also use code names, so it helps to kind of mask or disguise these ships when they're being built. The two of the biggest warships to come out of England in the first part of this war is going to be the CSS Florida and the CSS Alabama, both of which will have very illustrious careers as commerce raiders, especially the CSS Alabama. Florida is going to founder outside of Brazil, and the CSS Alabama is going to be sunk against, in a gunfight against the USS Kearsarge outside of France. Many of the crew are going to be captured. Some of them will eventually be sent back to England, and they're basically waiting to rejoin the Confederate Navy when they're out there. Now, after the sinking of CSS Florida and Alabama, although they had great careers, they ended pretty quickly. And Bullock is going to go and he is going to approach the Lyard brothers, and he's going to ask them to start constructing a number of ironclad rams for the Confederate Navy. And what happens is the U.S. isn't necessarily sitting by idly as these warships are being built in Britain for the Confederate Navy. No, you have U.S. officials, ambassadors over there, and they get word of this. What they're going to do is they're basically going to start barking up to the British authorities and telling them that the Confederacy is building warships in their own country, or in their country. So what happens is the Royal Marines and the crew of HMS Majesty are going to go and seize the Lyard rams, the two ironclad rams that the company had been making, in summer of 1863, becoming once again a major monkey wrench in the Confederate Navy's fleet, starting to grow in Europe. Not long after this, Bullock realizes Liverpool, England, it's a hard spot to build these warships at. There's a lot of eyes on him right over there. He's going to travel to Glasgow, Scotland. When he's over there, he sees the Sea King. The Sea King is a brand new vessel. It's actually starting to take on stores so that it can travel over to Bombay. It is a private vessel at this point, a merchant vessel. It's 220 feet long, features an 850 horsepower steam engine, and is fully rigged with 3 masts. So it has both sail power and steam power. And I'll get into this in a little bit when we start talking about its conversion to a warship. Now, the Sea King gets boarded up, and it sails to London. Bullock realizes he wants to purchase this vessel, so he hires a few private hands to purchase the Sea King so that the eyes of the British authorities, the eyes of the U.S. ambassadors aren't directly on them. And Sea King is going to officially be purchased in London. It's going to be purchased in London through, like I said, separate hands, private hands. What happens is the Sea King is going to leave London and sails into the Atlantic Ocean. There it is going to meet up with the steamer Laurel that just left Liverpool. The Laurel has on it the crew that is going to make up the first part of the CSS Shenandoah. It's also got cannons, it's got arms, everything needed to convert the Sea King into a warship. So by the time they get there, they're going to reach the coast of Madeira, which is a Portuguese island. And underneath a massive cliff on the side of this island, the steamer Laurel and the Sea King are going to meet up, and they're going to start the conversion of Sea King into a Confederate warship. Now, the individual who is there to oversee this conversion is Captain James Iredell Waddell. Waddell, he's 40 years old by this time. He's a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy. He walks with a limp because he got into a duel with a fellow midshipman during his underclassmen years at the Academy. He had served pretty significantly through the United States Navy. When he hears that the Confederate Navy, or that the Confederacy had seceded, he is going to actually jump ship, and he will hitchhike his way back to Maryland, eventually finding his way in a commission with the Confederate Navy. Early on, he is given command of the CSS Mississippi, a massive ironclad ram that is being constructed in New Orleans. Not that much longer, though, New Orleans is going to fall, and the Confederacy is forced to scuttle CSS Mississippi, ruining Waddell's position at commanding a ship. After that, he's going to be sent to Northern Virginia. He's going to command shore batteries near Richmond. He's actually going to command some of the shore batteries during the Battle of Drury's Bluff. He'll also command shore batteries outside of Charleston, South Carolina. Now, Waddell is sent to England in 1863, and he's waiting over there, waiting to receive a warship that he can command. Finally, that comes when the Sea King is being purchased by the Confederate Navy. Now, we'll mention here, Waddell is not the first person that the Confederate Navy wanted to lead this, or to captain this vessel. First choice would have been the dashing Raphael Semmes. Semmes, who had been captain of the CSS Alabama, was wounded though, and couldn't command the vessel. So, the command of Shenandoah would fall onto James Ardell Waddell. I will mention, Waddell was not necessarily liked by his crew. He was very indecisive, very skittish, very scraggly, and like I said, the men, especially his junior officers, really quickly did not like him. But he is the one who oversees the conversion of Sea King to the Shenandoah. On October 19, 1864, the CSS Shenandoah is officially going to be commissioned. Likewise, going on here in the Shenandoah Valley, that same exact day, the Battle of Cedar Creek is being fought. General Jubal Early's vaunted Army of the Valley is really in their last moments. When they're defeated, that's going to be the last real Confederate threat here in the Shenandoah Valley, the last major action in the valley. So on October 19, 1864, as one Shenandoah falls to the Confederacy, another one rises with the warship CSS Shenandoah. At this point, she is now, like I said, she has a steam engine. She also has 3 fully rigged masts. She has, the engine can go 8 knots. Under sail, it can go 16 knots. It also has a hoisted rudder, so in case it is sailing under sail, it can bring that rudder up above the waterline so that reduces the drag of the vessel. I will also mention here, the Sea King was originally constructed by Alexander Stephenson's sons, Glasgow, Scotland. It is not related to Alexander Stephen, the Vice President of the Confederacy, but I find that pretty ironic right there. So they have a number of cannons that are loaded onto the Shenandoah. This is going to include 4 8-inch smoothbores. This is also going to include 2 32-pounder cannon, 2 12-pounder Napoleons, which are going to be used as signal shots, and then 2 12-pounder Wentworth guns. The Wentworth guns are pretty unique. If anyone's been to seen one of these before, these are one of the only breech-loading guns or cannons used in the Civil War. If you want to see any examples of these, because they were used both on naval vessels and on the field, go out to the Gettysburg National Military Park. The Eternal Light Peace Memorial has 2 of them right to the left-hand side of that monument. You can see the breech loading, and the door will open up in the back. If you all want to see one of the bolts that these things would fire, go over to the Newmarket Visitor Center and Museum down in Newmarket, Virginia. It's our museum down there. They do have a Wentworth shell over there. The shell is basically just a big bolt twisted, and the Wentworth gun is rifled, but with the twisted bolt, it kind of helps that rifling go even further, so when it's being launched, it really is spinning. There's actually accounts of soldiers who watch, or soldiers and sailors who watch these things being fired, and the shell begins to somersault in the air, and soldiers and sailors would see it making that somersault as it flew through the air. Not only do they see that and see it pretty uniquely, but they also could hear the Wentworth guns. They made a very, very unique shriek that both foot soldiers and sailors are going to remember years after the war. So, the Shenandoah is pretty well armed by the time those cannons are being put on board, but there's a few issues that are plaguing the vessel already. First off, they don't have gun ports, so they have to cut those out so they can even use those cannons. Bigger issue is the Shenandoah is wildly undercrewed. The vessel has only about 43 crew members, most of which they actually have been transferred. They were taken from Liverpool over to Madeira on the steamer Laurel. The Laurel was the vessel that, like I said, had helped convert Sea King into the Shenandoah. Now, not only was it just those crew members from CSS Alabama, but the crew members of the Sea King were being recruited as well. Just a few of them had joined the crew of CSS Shenandoah. Many of them weren't necessarily too gung-ho to join a foreign war. So, Captain James Ardell Waddell is plagued with a crew of only about 43 when the Shenandoah is commissioned. He needs a crew of about 150 to properly sail Shenandoah, so he is wildly undermanned. He's going to spend the next few weeks cutting out the gun ports, really converting Shenandoah into a warship. But there's another big issue. Not only are they short of hands, they also forgot the gun tackles back in Liverpool. The gun tackles were a series of ropes that would keep the cannons tied back to the sides of the ship so that when they fired, they don't retract or they don't recoil and go through the gun deck. Shenandoah, if they use these guns, it would cause all through the deck. As those cannons recoil, they're going to break anything inside that vessel. On top of that, I also will mention, even if Shenandoah did have all of those gun tackles, if it could shot in a complete broadside like you would see in the movies, Master and Commander and all that, the Shenandoah would probably capsize, or capsize. The vessel was not constructed to be a warship. It was constructed to be a merchant vessel. Now it is a warship, though. So, the Captain James Iredell Waddell realizes that he needs to go ahead and start sailing, start recruiting sailors on the seas. Within a month and a half, he's going to score 7 prizes. Those are vessels that he captures, burns, bonds on the seas. In late October, October 28th, he's going to run into the warship, or the vessel, the Mogul. It's a former U.S. ship. There's a big problem, though. It was recently sold to Britain, and Waddell doesn't want to go ahead and start, getting the British upset about this right here. So they have a huge issue going on through the ship, and the junior crew members start to create animosity against their Captain James Iredell Waddell. The animosity between Waddell and the junior officers is really seen between Waddell and Lieutenant Whittle. That's confusing there, Waddell and Whittle. They did not like each other. Lieutenant Whittle definitely would stand up to Waddell many, many times. Waddell would sometimes order punishments to certain members of the crew, or would order this. Crew members would convince him otherwise, and he would retract those statements. Really does weaken his position in the crew's eyes as well. They see him as indecisive and, with a weak spine. So on, like I said, October 28th, the Shenandoah will dock up next to the Mogul. After finding out that the ship was properly sold to the British, they are basically going to let the warship go, or they're going to let the merchant ship go. And this definitely helps bolster that animosity between Waddell and his junior officers. Just 2 days later, on October 30th, the CSS Shenandoah is going to run into another ship, the Alina, another U.S. ship. This time it's carrying British cargo. Although it's carrying British cargo, it has papers that are not fully notarized. The crew decide that it's not notarized, it is not really British cargo right there. They're going to go ahead and they're going to capture the crew, they're going to capture the supplies, take it on board, and they're going to sink the Alina. Now, Shenandoah starts to quickly build up a number of prisoners in its bottom decks here. Keep that in mind as we keep on going here. Just about another week later, on November 6, 1864, the schooner Charter Oak is met by the CSS Shenandoah. This is another U.S. vessel, and this time it's carrying citizen prisoners. The crew doesn't necessarily know what to do with it, but they take on the prisoners, they sink the schooner Charter Oak. They are already in the midst of their voyage. So I'm also going to hand out that photo right there. That is of James Iredell Waddell. That is the captain of the CSS Shenandoah. I forgot to hand that out earlier. Later on that month, on November 25th, 1864, the Shenandoah is going to cross the equator. If anybody here has studied naval history or has a sailor in their family, you know what happens when you cross the equator. You go through the crossing the line ceremony. The crew members return from pollywogs to trusted shellbacks, amazing rituals that the crew are going to all take part in. James Iredell Waddell will dress up as Neptune. If you guys are interested in the crossing the line ceremony, it is still done by naval ships, by vessels as they cross the equator. And like I said, this happens November 25th, 1864. Later on, they're going to end up running into the schooner, a separate schooner, an unnamed schooner, that is filled to the brim with stores. Is also fully crewed, and, well, the Shenandoah is going to take those stores. That includes those very valuable gun tackles. Now they can finally use those guns. Before, when they would pull up next to these vessels, they show their guns without the other vessels' knowledge that they can't use them, and basically strong-arm them into surrendering. Now they do have use of those cannon. Well, what happens is they're also going to start taking on the prisoners as well. And like I said earlier, they take more and more prisoners on. They're starting to get overloaded with prisoners. You have to feed them. These people are usually sitting down in the brig, so sickness is very common to happen with prisoners on board vessels. And also, more and more prisoners that you are massing up below deck, well, that's more people that can then create mutiny and try and retake or take over the vessel. So, like I said, the Shenandoah is going to quickly start, or every single time it captures one of these vessels, it's going to try to recruit some of the crew members. And you might be wondering, why would these crew members want to go join the vessel that had just commandeered their ship probably sunk it or burnt it. Well, think about it from the perspective of these sailors. You have two options. You either get sent to the brig and you're now a prisoner, or you can sign on with this crew, do a very similar job, sometimes with even better pay, and really your job is not too much different. So many of them are going to join the crew of Shenandoah, and the Shenandoah starts to really quickly build up an international crew. It's not just Southerners. You do have Northerners who fight on the Shenandoah. You have Europeans, Frenchmen, Englishmen, you're eventually going to have Australians. You have Mongolians who are also fighting on the Shenandoah. So we have many different continents that are being represented on this vessel right here. It's not just Southerners who are sailing the Shenandoah. Well, in December 4th, 1864, the Shenandoah is going to run into the Edward. This is the first whaler that the Shenandoah had run into. This was the main goal of Shenandoah, is to target the United States whaling fleets. Now, 1860s, whaling had kind of gone downhill a little bit. 1853 is when it had peaked. It had been in a pretty rough decline since then, and that's mostly because of the invention of kerosene, the discovery of oil in Pennsylvania. But the Civil War is going to drive industry, and whale blubber, whale bones will be needed. So whaling will make a comeback throughout the Civil War, and no community is going to suffer the wrath of CSS Shenandoah more than New Bedford, Massachusetts. Massive whaling hub alongside New London and Connecticut. New Bedford, Mass. really has a number of ships that are sunk, burnt, or bonded by Shenandoah. And this is going to really throw a monkey wrench into New Bedford's whaling industry. This really crushes the community for a period of time throughout the war. So like I said, no community feels the wrath of Shenandoah more than New Bedford, Massachusetts. That's where the Edward came from. By the time the Shenandoah pulls alongside the the Edward was already busy grappling up a whale. They didn't see the Shenandoah arrive. And they're commandeered. The vessel is captured and is going to be torched. Just a few days later, the crew of the Shenandoah start hearing a very strange noise, a whoosh whoosh noise, a whoosh whoosh noise going on in the rear. They lift up the propeller. Remember that propeller blade can be lowered or raised alongside the rudder. They'll raise up the propeller, and they're going to see down, there's going to be a crack that's starting to form. Minor repairs will be made to this crack, but they realize they're going to need to dock up and seek major repairs. So the Shenandoah had a problem. They could go ahead and they could dock up in Cape Town, but by this time, they know that the U.S. Navy probably is made aware of their existence. And they're already sending warships into the Atlantic. Now, one of the first places they're probably going to go ahead and sail to is Cape Town. If the Shenandoah had docked in that city, it probably would have been attacked by the USS Iroquois. James Iredell Waddell decides, we're going to bypass Cape Town, we're going to sail around the Cape of Good Hope, we're going to cross into the Indian Ocean and sail to Melbourne, modern-day Australia. On December 16th, Shenandoah will pass by the Cape of Good Hope, and on December 29th, it will run into another U.S. merchant ship, the Delphine. Delphine, this is going to become a big moment for the crew right here. They're going to start to commandeer the Delphine, and Captain Nichols from the Delphine starts to approach the officers of Shenandoah, and he tells them, you can't do anything to my vessel. We're sailing right now. My wife is below deck. She's deathly sick right there. She's on her deathbed. James Iredell Waddell sends his surgeons to the Delphine. Surgeon comes back just a few minutes later, and he says, Captain Nichols' wife is in amazing condition right there. She is not sick whatsoever. She's been lying. So the crew, including Captain Nichols and his wife, are captured. And this is going to really start to make the Shenandoah start overflowing with prisoners, especially when you have Captain Nichols' wife on board. She is what we would call today a mean girl. She stirs drama everywhere she goes on the vessel. She flirts with the junior officers, right in front of her husband, by the way. She's going to try and commandeer Captain Waddell's cabin a number of times. I don't even know how this would have happened. And like I said, she becomes a big, issue to the crew. They really roll their eyes every single time she's walking on the deck. She starts commanding the crew to do tasks for her. In fact, when she's being transferred from the Delphine to the Shenandoah, she orders the crew to start taking her personal goods and bringing it to the Shenandoah. When she's on board, she goes over to Captain Waddell and refers to him as the Pirate King. Now, the crew is not the only thing that the Shenandoah had captured from the Delphine. They've captured a number of stores, food, ammunition, also captured a nice big barrel of ice. When they were trying to wrangle this barrel of ice on board the Shenandoah, it had fallen into the ocean. By the time they bring it on board, the ice had melted. And this had kind of served as a microcosm for the Shenandoah's voyage already. They had run into a number of vessels, they had scored minor prizes, but for the most part, they just had a full storage of crew, and no major prizes, no major whaling ships that had been destroyed, other than the Edward so far. Later on, by New Year will pass just a few days later on in the month of January, on January 25th, 1865, the CSS Shenandoah is going to arrive outside of Melbourne. The harbor pilot is going to sail out there, assuming that this ship was a British warship, the Royal Standard. When he docks, he's surprised when he hears Southern accents and he sees a Confederate stainless banner waving. Well, Melbourne and Australia, at this point, were really big supporters of the American Civil War. You might wonder why. Well, Australia had its cotton trade as well. As long as the Civil War was going on, the Southern cotton trade was basically being halted, and that meant the Australian cotton trade was free to basically take over. So the citizens of Melbourne, the citizens of Australia really did like this war going on. On top of that, the Australians were very enamored with rebellious forces at this time. So the harbor pilot tells the crew, you guys have some friends waiting for you in Melbourne. By the time it starts sailing into the city, some U.S. merchant ships had been docked up there. They start retracting their U.S. flags. Some of them have been carrying European flags to go ahead and try and navigate around these commerce raiders. So they'll start flying up Swedish flags, British flags, Norwegian flags, and basically trying to hide themselves that they were American from the crew of Shenandoah. Now, Shenandoah was only supposed to be docked in Melbourne for a day. This goes to the British neutrality laws. But like I said, those laws had a number of gray areas in them, and the Shenandoah was able to basically navigate around this and was able to stay in port until her propeller was repaired. Now, by the time Shenandoah docks up there, the crew are treated up like they are celebrities. They are the rock stars of Melbourne. They're brought to the local bars, they're brought to the very prestigious local Melbourne club, they're given tours of the local gold mines, and like I said, they're treated very, very well. In fact, the Shenandoah, when it's docked up in Melbourne, we've got a picture of it right here. Pass that around. That picture was taken of the Shenandoah while in Melbourne. That is the only known photograph of the Shenandoah while it is under that name. Remember, it does have a few names that it goes by later on, or before and later on after the war. So this picture of Shenandoah was taken, like I said, in Melbourne. You can even see the Confederate stainless banner flying up there near the top. Now, the citizens of Melbourne, like I said, they treated the crew like they were celebrities. The ladies loved the sailors. And on top of that, these people were really enamored with, like I said, rebelliousness. So they wanted to see this famous warship that had started making waves in the newspapers. So the Shenandoah's crew is actually going to set up booths where the citizens of Melbourne can come down and pay a small fee just to get a glimpse of the CSS Shenandoah. Now, it's not just fun and games and partying while they're in Melbourne. There is a number of U.S. sailors who are there, and that includes the crew of a merchant vessel known as the Mustang. The Mustang and the crew members of the Shenandoah, they didn't like each other, and one night they got into a pretty significant bar fight. Sabers or pistols will be drawn, blood will be spilled, and basically the Shenandoah realizes that starting to wear out their welcome here in the city. The crew members of Mustang, they want to go ahead and put revenge on the crew members of Shenandoah just for being in town there and for starting that bar fight. So the Mustang is going to create an improvised explosive device, mostly created of gunpowder, and is going to try to attach this to the Shenandoah one night. It fails to detonate, but like I said earlier, the Shenandoah is really quickly starting to realize that their welcome is being wear thin in Melbourne. So a few days later, it's going to eventually sail out of Melbourne, heading into the Pacific Ocean. Now, this wasn't just a great stop for the Shenandoah. They were able to repair their rudder, but they lost 19 crew members who decided to go ahead and disembark and leave the vessel. They also were able to dump out all of their prisoners, which includes Captain Nichols' wife, who marched her way down to the U.S. Embassy over there and tried explaining everything that had happened on the Shenandoah for them, but they were kind of held between a rock and a hard place. There was nothing they could do about Shenandoah being in the city. Although Shenandoah had lost 19 crew members in Melbourne, and also started creating almost an international crisis, when Melbourne citizens tried enlisting in the Shenandoah. This includes a cook by the name of Charlie. This is going to breach the Foreign Enlistment Act, and the Shenandoah, like I said, starting to get into legal trouble, starting to get attacked now by the Mustang and U.S. merchant vessels in the city. So they leave Melbourne, like I said, leaving 19 crew members behind. But something miraculous happens right when they sail out of Melbourne. 40 to 42 new crew members start to arrive on the boat from the below decks. Well, these were Melbourne citizens who were excited to join the crew of Shenandoah. They had stowed themselves on board. Reportedly, Captain Iredell Waddle did not know that this was going on. Not really sure if he did or didn't, but now he had about 40 to 42 new crew members to man his vessel. He's going to leave on February 18th, 1864. They start heading into the Pacific Ocean, sailing towards the Caroline Islands, start to approach Ascension Island, the island of Pompeii, and they are going to see in Madeleine-Himwa, I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong, Madeleine-Himwa Bay, they're going to see 4 merchant vessels docked up there. Well, the Shenandoah will dock at will anchor at the mouth of that bay, and it's going to start sending some crew members on shore. We're going to talk to some of the indigenous tribes that are living on the island out there, and they're going to talk to King Nanwarki, who agrees that if they can capture some of these stores from these vessels and give it to the king, then they will be allowed to go ahead and burn these vessels, bond these vessels, or sink them. So there's 4 ships out there. 3 of which are confirmed to be U.S. merchant ships as they are flying U.S. flags. That includes the Edward Carey out of San Francisco, the Hector out of New Bedford, the Pearl out of New London, Connecticut, and the final of which, the Harvest of the Honolulu, which was flying a Hawaiian Federation flag, but had a U.S. crew. So the crew of Shenandoah didn't really know, is this a foreign vessel, is this a U.S. vessel? Well, it starts to become realized when they find munitions and arms aboard the Harvest of the Honolulu. So they go back to King Nanwarki. They agree that they will torch those vessels and they will get some of the munitions to King Nanwarki. As a thank you to the crew of CSS Shenandoah, King Nanwarki of the indigenous tribe that was living in Madeleine-Himwa, once again, sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, decides to give the crew 2 chickens and 2 coconuts to give to his friend, the big warrior, Jefferson Davis. This is the only foreign leaders who had formally recognized the Confederate president. So this actually happened with this crew of CSS Shenandoah. They're going to, the next few days, torch up the Edward Carey. They're going to torch up the Hector, the Pearl. Finally, they will torch up the Harvest of Honolulu as well. And that's going to happen on April 10th, 1865. What's going on April 10th, 1865? Well, all the way here in the state of Virginia, it's still April 9th, 1865. As the Harvest of Honolulu goes up in flames, Robert E. Lee is surrendering to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, basically ending the war here in Virginia, beginning the end of the Civil War. This is not known by the crew members of Shenandoah, and it will not be known for a period of time. After this, they're going to sail out from the Caroline Islands and start heading northward to the Russian waters. They head out there, they're going to see another ship, the Abigail. They're going to board the Abigail, and what they find out on there is that, once again, this is a ship from New Bedford, Massachusetts, a whaling ship, and it is loaded with booze. And the crew of Shenandoah are very excited to see this. They start going on a bender. 2 days, they're drinking, they're going crazy. Waddle is not able to control his crew. There's actually a whaling ship that escapes them during this little party that they have on board. Finally, Waddle is able to, calm down his crew members, and they start sailing up north towards the Arctic waters. Right around this time, James Bullock, still in Liverpool, is going to write to Waddle, ordering him to sail to a United States port, or what was a prior Confederate States port, and surrender his warship. His men will be paroled and will be returned home. Waddle is not going to receive this message. Just a few weeks later, in June of 1865, the Shenandoah is going to dock up and is going to try and capture the William Thompson, another whaling ship out of New Bedford, Massachusetts. They capture some stores on board, but what they find is a number of newspapers that start to terrify them. These newspapers mention that Robert E. Lee had surrendered, but and they're scouring through these newspapers, finding any type of information they can. They're wondering, are these propaganda pieces? Were these sent out by the U.S. Navy for us specifically to think that they had surrendered, so that will surrender? Well, they keep on going through and they find a quote from Jefferson Davis saying that he hopes to renew the war effort. And they take this with in full words right there. They're going to try and continue their mission. So they're going to continue northward. They're going to actually burn the William Thompson after capturing it. And on June 22nd, the next day, they're going to run into a cluster of whaling ships. While they burn a number of them, they are actually burning a ship known as the Milo. Another ship known as the Sophia Thornton is trying to sail away. The Shenandoah is going to launch a few volleys of its cannon towards the Sophia Thornton. The final shots of the Civil War are going to be from the CSS Shenandoah, launched towards the Sophia Thornton, and that is going to happen on June 22nd, 1865, months following Robert E. Lee's surrender. Now, like I said, these are the final shots of the American Civil War, but this is not the end of CSS Shenandoah's career. Within 2 days, she had just captured 6 new warships. She had also had new maps that were telling her all about where the whaling grounds in the North Pacific were. She's now got the key to her mission. So she's going to go, and she's going to eventually run into another vessel known as the Favorite. The Favorite and the Shenandoah do have a little gunfight. I can actually think this might be the final shots of the Civil War, although it was not fired from the ship's main battery. A few of the ship's Confederate Marines had exchanged shots with the captain of the Favorite, who was drunk in his cabin, launching pot shots towards the Shenandoah. His crew were able to calm him down, and they surrendered their vessel before it was bonded. The Shenandoah goes on a tear after this. Now having the maps of the Northern Pacific whaling fleet, she ends up capturing 25 prizes in less than a week. This is a really crazy sail right there. And on August 2nd, she's going to dock up next to a British ship. They're starting to exchange information, say hello to each other. This warship is the Barracuda, and it has some of the worst news that Shenandoah could receive. Newspapers, British newspapers, explaining the end of the American Civil War and the capture of Confederate President Jefferson Davis. The British sailors confirmed to the crew of Shenandoah that this is new newspapers. These are real newspapers. Shenandoah is now put into a little monkey wrench right here. They don't know what to do. They're scared that they are now recognized as pirates to the United States. Shenandoah could go ahead and sail back to Melbourne, but James Iredell Waddell remembers that his family is still in Liverpool, England. So he announces to the crew that they will sail through the Pacific Ocean, south in the Pacific, around South America, and they will sail through the Atlantic Ocean back to Liverpool, England, so that he can go back to his family. He doesn't tell the other crew members about his family, that this is so he can go back to his family. That is likely the reason why he is going back to Liverpool. Now, Shenandoah has a pretty long journey from here on out. She sails around the southern tip of South America. She'll sail through the Atlantic waters, crossing the equator once again. She'll sail all the way back to Liverpool, England. On November 5th, 1865, the Shenandoah arrives outside of the River Mersey in England. She's sailing no flag, scared that if she sails the Confederate flag, she is going to be considered a pirate. The harbor pilot sails out there, sees that there's no flag flying on this warship, and he says, "Yeah, right, you are a pirate right there. You got to fly some type of country's flag if you want to dock up in Liverpool." So, reluctantly, James Iredell Waddell orders the crew to unfurl the Confederate stainless banner one more time. They unfurl it, and they start to sail down the River Mersey. Liverpool citizens rush to the waterfront to get a glimpse of this vessel. It is in a rough condition. It had been on a cruise for just over a year. Its copper plating had started to scrape off. Like I said, it was riddled with barnacles and seaweed. The ship was a ghost of its former self. But the citizens of Liverpool knew what this vessel was. They had heard about the Shenandoah in their newspapers, and they had heard about the American Civil War. Now, as it was sailing up the River Mersey, like I said, the citizens are all running to the waterfront to see this warship as it goes ahead and docks right next to the HMS Donegal. The crew is going to officially be paroled, or is going to be surrendered. The warship is going to be surrendered to HMS Donegal the next day. The next morning, on November 6, 1865, James Iredell Waddell wakes up. He disembarks from the vessel, and he marches his way over to Liverpool Town Hall. is there where he surrenders the warship CSS Shenandoah. This is the final act of the American Civil War. Months earlier had Robert E. Lee's army had surrendered. Months earlier had Jefferson Davis been captured, and months earlier had Stand Waty's Confederate forces surrendered. Now, the Shenandoah had surrendered. The final Confederate flag had been retracted, the final shots had been given, and the final warship surrendered. The final forces surrendered. Months after their parent government had disbanded. Now, the Shenandoah is not going to go ahead, actually her crew is going to be paroled. All the American servicemen, all the European servicemen will be paroled, sent back home, except for the British sailors, who had breached the Foreign Enlistment Act. They are going to be tried. Not only this, but the Shenandoah is also going to open up a major international crisis between Britain and the United States, known as the Alabama Claims. Named after the commerce raider Alabama, the U.S. basically argued that the British had violated the Neutrality Acts by allowing these ships to be constructed on their soil and in their docks to be used against Union merchant vessels. And after a very lengthy diplomatic dispute, they're basically going to settle where Britain is going to pay the United States $15 million in damages. This is a big moment between the United States and Britain. This is going to start bringing them together, those two countries. You're going to eventually see them as an alliance in the 20th century. But at this point, they had not liked each other, and this is going to be kind of them starting to come to terms with each other. Like I said, the Alabama claims are pretty important. They directly happened because of the CSS Florida, Alabama, and Shenandoah. Today, the CSS Shenandoah is not forgotten about, I would say. Here in the Valley, we don't talk much about naval history, but we are the namesake of the Shenandoah. Like I said, when they had named the vessel Shenandoah, they had named it after General Jackson's campaign. That's what they were thinking about when they named it this. It received its nickname and was commissioned at Shenandoah the same exact day that the Battle of Cedar Creek was being fought here, the last major Confederate stand here in the Shenandoah Valley. If you go to Liverpool, there is a plaque in Liverpool Town Hall that mentions that this was the place where the American Civil War had ended. That is also mentions it also mentions the crew members. Some of them have been from the United States, some of them had been British sailors as well. If you go down to Melbourne, there's a number of, I don't want to say graffiti pieces, but art pieces, public art pieces on the sides of buildings that show the Shenandoah, so it's not forgotten about in Melbourne either. And if you go to the American Civil War Museum in Richmond, Virginia, they actually have the original flag of the CSS Shenandoah. You're welcome to pass this around right here. This is a photo of the CSS Shenandoah stainless banner flag, the last Confederate flag to be surrendered in the American Civil War. Now, what happens to Shenandoah after this war? Well, it's going to be sold from a few different hands, eventually sold to the Sultan of Zanzibar. It's going to be renamed the El Majidi. And it's going to eventually be damaged in a hurricane in April of 1872, after which the damaged warship, or the damaged ex-warship, is going to try and limp its way through the Gulf of Aden, trying to make its way to Bombay, the coast of India, which was actually, weirdly enough, the original destination for the Sea King before it even becomes Shenandoah. On the way to Bombay, the Shenandoah is going to sink. It's basically going to lose the majority of its crew members. The wreck has never been found. Within 12 months and 7 days, the CSS Shenandoah had sailed 58,000 miles. The Confederate flag of CSS Shenandoah was the only Confederate flag to circumnavigate the globe. It was the last Confederate flag to surrender. After sailing 58,000 miles in a little over a year, the Shenandoah is going to score 38 prizes on the seas. This is a pretty high number right there. That would amount to about $1,004,000. Today, that would be $27 million in damages that the CSS Shenandoah had caused to the United States, primarily the U.S. whaling fleet, and primarily the whaling fleet that was headquartered in New Bedford, Massachusetts. 160 years later, we are here today talking about the Shenandoah in the valley of its namesake. Now, I want to go ahead and continue here. If you guys want to see more programs like this, the best way to go ahead and do that is to support the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation. I know we've got a number of volunteers and members here in the crowd. I know you guys know what your help does, what you guys do to help our foundation here. The more members we have, the more we can have these programs here to educate the general public on events such as CSS Shenandoah, battles here in the Shenandoah Valley, instances and famous stories, and maybe not famous stories that happened here in the Valley throughout the American Civil War. The best way to support battlefield preservation and Civil War education in this valley is to support the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation, who is the managing body of this building right here in the National Historic District. Without further ado, you guys, that is our program here today. I do have a few more photos I do want to hand out. This one, I handed out the Waddle photo. I handed out the photo of Shenandoah, and this is the last one. That is the voyage to Shenandoah. You can see it sailing out of Liverpool, England, sailing into the South Atlantic, around the tip of South Africa, over to Melbourne, into the Pacific Ocean, into the northern Pacific Ocean, and eventually around the tip of South America, back into the Atlantic, and back to Liverpool. Like I said, everybody, without further ado, that is our program on CSS Shenandoah. We'll likely be giving this program again in November on the 160th anniversary of that vessel's surrender. So if you guys want to join us again in November, you guys are completely welcome to. But thank you guys, everybody, for being here today. Thank you for being here. Any questions before we leave?
Is the foundation private?
Foundation is private. We do receive federal grants. We do receive help with a few different organizations, but we are a private organization. It's the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation that manages the National Historic District. Any other questions?
Two questions, Mike.
Yes.
When they took this famous banner, did they not have the last Confederate flag, or since it changed on March the 4th, 1865, did they even know the flag had changed?
I don't think they even knew that the flag had been changed. When they left Liverpool, or when the Laurel left Liverpool with the stores and the goods that would create the Shenandoah, or the Sea King from Shenandoah, that flag was on board with it. So likely they did not even know that the bloodstained banner was a thing by the time that they had surrendered. Pretty interesting fact right there.
And the folks that stayed behind in Melbourne, any idea if any of their descendants are still hanging around Australia?
I did not look into the individuals who had disembarked in Melbourne. I do not know if any of them are still out there in Australia. That is a good question right there. Any other ones? Yes?
What does it mean for the ship to be bonded?
So a ship to be bonded basically means, it's a good question there, means that the crew is going to be unmolested, the stores will not be touched, the vessel will head back to its home port and will be out of commission for the remainder of the war. And basically, the financial costs of that vessel will then be given to the Confederate States government. And usually, if you had pretty good insurance, you would try and convince your captors to bond your vessel instead of burning it. So the Shenandoah did do that to a number of vessels, but a number of them were also torched and sunk by the Shenandoah's guns as well. Any other questions before we leave off here today? Once again, happy 250th anniversary of the Battles of Lexington and Concord, everybody. We're beginning America 250, and we're just ending off Civil War 160. So thank you guys for being here today.